Howdy, everyone. This is Darius Dale here to present our macro minute for Monday, April 18th, 2022. Happy Easter Monday to those of you who celebrate. Happy Passover to those of you who celebrate that. We're all in this big thing together. Let's hop right into it. Asset markets, starting with stocks here down this morning, commodities up, crypto down, dollar up, global bond yields up. Market moving headlines this morning over the weekend. Yeah, China cut the reserve requirement ratio for banks on Friday, but it refrained from lowering its benchmark policy rate. It's taking a cautious approach to policy easing, which is something you heard from us for the past several months. In Shanghai, officials reported the first deaths from their surging COVID-19 outbreak. They've also published plans to resume production after the prolonged lockdown, encouraging business to adopt what sounds terrifying, but so-called closed-loop management, where workers live on site and are tested regularly. If that's not something out of a George Orwell novel, I've not heard it yet. Anyway, earnings this week, you got Amex, Bank of America, BNY Mellon, IBM, Johnson Johnson, Netflix, and Tesla. So pretty big week on earnings. Got to be pretty big over the next few weeks. St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard speaking starting around the close today. Obviously, he's been bearish. He's been quite hawkish, so expect some of that to potentially weigh on the last few minutes of trading. We got Chuck Evans speaking Tuesday. He'll be a little bit more dovish. Mary Daly, Chuck Evans speaking Wednesday as well, a little bit more dovish relative to Bullard. But then you got Mr. Powell coming back in with the bear case here. The ECB President Lagarde and Powell speaking at the IMF event on Thursday. You have preliminary April PMI data out on Thursday night and on Friday morning. And then lastly, Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey to speak Friday. So a lot of hawkish Fed, ECB, and BOE speak coming down the pike at you this week. Big movers, Japan's Nikkei 225 index minus 1% overnight. Bitcoin and Ethereum off 3% and 4% respectively. Taking it to the charts this morning, U.S. dollar that remains bullish from the perspective of our volatility adjusted momentum signal. With 1.5% of downside versus 0.6% of upside in its probable range. Gold neutral VAMs there, only 0.2% of upside versus 4.5% of downside in its probable range. So be aware of that if you're long gold. Maybe book some gains or open some risk reversals, put spreads, etc. If you risk manage it from an option standpoint. 10-year nominal Treasury yield, bullish VAM still minus 34 basis points of downside versus 9 basis points of upside. There, high yield OAS or high yield credit spreads. They're looking at the CDX indices. Bullish VAM still with 31 basis points of downside versus 19 basis points of upside. S&P 500, that is neutral VAMs at minus 0.7% of downside versus 5.7% of upside there. VIX bearish VAM still minus 41% of downside versus only 0.6% of upside. So be aware of that there if you're selling vol. NASDAQ futures are neutral. Still neutral, minus 0.3% of downside versus 9.9% of upside in its probable range. So a lot of reward relative to risk there. Russell not so much. Russell 2000 neutral VAMs minus 2.5% of downside versus 6.4% of upside. Bitcoin neutral VAMs still minus 1% of downside to the lower boundary of its probable range with 16% of upside. Ethereum neutral VAMs minus 2% of downside versus 18% of upside there. Shanghai Composite out of China. This does not look like a chart of a stock market that's about to go under major easing. Just for the record, still bearish VAMs decidedly with minus 3.8% of downside versus 2.7% of upside. WTI crude oil neutral VAMs there, 6% of upside versus 16% of downside in its probable range there. And then lastly, ag neutral VAMs. That is overbought with only 0.1% of upside versus 7.2% of downside in its probable range. And then industrial metals, neutral VAMs, kind of in a fair fight there, minus 3.8% of downside versus 3.5% of upside. So with that, Darius Dale presenting our macro minute for Monday, April 18th, 2022. Best of luck out there this week.